Hello, everyone. I'm assuming we're live now, so I'm just going to go ahead. Welcome to YALLWrite. I hope you guys have been enjoying the panels today. This year, we're doing a primarily craft-focused festival, and it's been really fun to see the panels. So I hope you're all enjoying yourselves. This is the panel Dark Stories Shine Bright, and we're going to keep it pretty chill. It's going to be a round table where we all talk about dark stories and how and why and all of the above for writing them. So I'm going to introduce our amazing crew here real quick. And then if you guys could each introduce yourselves just by saying what you're working on right now, state your pronouns, and we can jump into the questions. And I'll go for about half an hour, and then we can open it up to questions from the audience. So our illustrious panel today, we have Z. Brewer, whose latest book is Into the Real. We have Adam Sass, the author of Surrender Your Sons. Jay Kristoff, who is known for so many stories. Illuminate Files, Empire of the Vampire, which is coming up. Kalynn Bayron, whose latest book is Cinderella is Dead. You guys are amazing. Please tell the audience a little bit about your latest, and we'll go from there. And I'm going to pick on Z first.
Of course. No. Hi, I am Z Brewer. My pronouns are they, them. And right now, what I'm working on, I actually just started working on a middle grade horror kind of thing. But most of my focus lately, since Into the Real came out, has been I'm actually writing for a video game company, which has been really amazing. I'm the lead scriptwriter of Poorly Timed Games. So that's been a lot of fun. But yeah, that's me.
That's so cool. Adam.
Hi, everyone. My name is Adam Sass. My pronouns are he, him. Since my debut, Surrender Your Sons, came out about 2 months ago, I have been actually working, and it's funny, we're talking about dark stories. I'm actually working on a romantic comedy right now, so I'm doing a departure from that. But I also am tag teaming at the same time on another dark story that's a thriller about teen fugitives.
Awesome. Kalynn.
Hi, I'm Kalynn Bayron. I'm the author of Cinderella is Dead. My pronouns are she, her. And so Cinderella is Dead came out this past summer, and right now I am working on a middle grade paranormal.
And finally, Jay.
Hey everybody, I'm Jay Kristoff. I'm a he, him. I'm currently working on the third part of the Aurora Rising trilogy with my co-author Amy Kaufman, and my new epic fantasy Empire of the Vampire is coming out in September next year. So I'm starting copy edits on that in like 3 days, which is the worst part.
Love it. Okay, so I will dive in with a really general question for everyone, which is, why do we do this? Y'all, why do we write the dark stories? What draws you to writing dark stories, and what about dark stories calls to you from a craft perspective?
Are you going to pick on us, or are we just going to jump in? I think you're going to have to pick on us, right?
Yes.
You just have to be mean, Marie. I know it's not in your nature, but
let the roulette fall.
Okay,
seriously,
Jake,
you got to pick someone, and we're just going to sit there.
We're all incredibly shy people who write about these very dark stories.
Authors. We're
Yeah.
No one's going to say anything unless you make us.
Yeah, well, I think I'll jump in first, and I'll say specifically why I wrote my dark story, Surrender Your Sons. If you haven't read it, is about a group of queer teens who are brought to a conversion therapy camp on a deserted island. And it's a sort of an escape adventure thriller, but it's also obviously conversion therapy is an extremely traumatizing topic, and and something about the darkness of that, obviously it had to be a dark story because you're talking about a lot of nefarious people, and you're talking about traumatizing events. And I think what draws me to that is I feel like, especially with teen stories, I think I always just, when I was a teen, like I really was always drawn to, because I mean, my emotions were, I'm sure I was not alone, and that were very chaotic, and I was, I felt like I was seeing a lot of things, a lot of kind of darkness in the world that I felt like at the time I thought nobody else was seeing but me. And so I think that's kind of why I was drawn to these stories, because I felt like they were speaking to things that were maybe verboten, or kind of lifting up the rock and seeing what was underneath.
Mm-hmm.
That's interesting, Adam, because actually my book, Into the Real, also features conversion therapy and how horrible it is. But for me, writing is cathartic. It's just like, I love taking the muck that I'm dealing with and like splashing it on the page to actually face it. And so I'm always drawn to those dark things. It makes me happy to write darkness. I mean, does that make any sense? But yeah, I feel better after I write those things. So, and I think a lot of people are experiencing a lot of dark emotions that need to feel better about it. So, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I agree with what Adam is saying. I mean, it's a catharsis for me personally to write about dark topics and explore dark places. But one of the most important things for me as a kid, like, I guess the first place I went into the dark was through music, the music that I listened to. And I remember the first time walking into a room with 1,000 other people who listened to the same things that I did and found the same meaning in the same words that I did, and realizing that, oh, I'm actually not alone the way that I'm feeling right now. Even though I feel like an outsider a lot of the time, there's a whole bunch of people who feel the same way that I do, not only in the audience, but the people up there on stage creating it. So yeah, it's a way to let people know that the things that they're feeling aren't unusual, even though you might feel that way at the time. And then you're not alone in the struggles that you're facing, whatever they are. I write fantasy. I'm not dealing with the same kind of serious topics that the other guys are, but I think the feeling at the heart of it is the same, letting people know that they are not alone.
Yeah, I agree with all of you. I think it comes from, for me, it comes from a place of just trying to figure out, work through issues in my own life. I think with Cinderella is Dead, something that I wanted to focus on was a systems of patriarchy, of heteronormative societal expectations, and fantasy. I think is a really good place to explore some of those topics. And I think that it's just another tool, I think, for confronting, the world around us and kind of dealing with it in our own way.
I would think also, I think on a lighter note, since we're also talking about how to make these stories that are about heavy topics be exciting, accessible, maybe not bogged down, writing villains is just fun. To me, it's so fun to write these wicked people and say these terrible things, or just have them kind of do that. I mean, it's kind of starts with Disney villains, I think, kind of the love of that, and then it kind of just turns into it's just very fun. And in these scary dark stories, the villains are really kind of reigning supreme.
Yeah, I think villains, that's oh, sorry, did you want to go ahead?
No, you go. I've got the Australia time delay going on. I'm 3 seconds behind everybody else. So.
Yeah, I love villains. I think that was one of the things that I loved most about these fairy tales that I read as a kid, or that I saw, Disney princesses. Those, Ursula was the most interesting character to me in The Little Mermaid. I wanted to know what the stepmother and evil stepsisters were, what was their deal. I just wanted to kind of figure out, who they were and what they were doing. And so, yeah, it's fun. It's fun to kind of, delve into those darker topics.
It's also really fun to watch reader reactions to the horrible things that you did in your book. Waking up in the morning and getting an all caps tweet or a message on Instagram or whatever from the person who got to that part in the book, and exactly what part they're talking about. But it's also cool to write a story where dark things do happen and characters aren't safe, because it lets you go to kind of unexpected and scary places. I'm sure everyone remembers what it was like when you watched the Red Wedding episode of Game of Thrones and you're sitting there watching the screen going, holy, did they actually do that? We have the same kind of freedom because, you're writing outside the traditional kind of hero's journey structures, and you can go to places that other stories don't. So it makes you nervous writing it, but it makes your readers nervous reading it. So it's fun.
A lot of how dare you, all caps.
Yeah, that's right.
Oh, I never forgive you. Yeah.
Who hurt you?
There's a thing I did years ago that my readers will never forgive me for. They still get tweets that are like, "How could you do that?" It's like, I did, and here we are.
I am talking to the right group of people here. Well, now that we're on the subject of villains, I'm curious because like building dark stories is not just about the dark world that we live in. It is dark characters. And so how do you go about building a villain? Because some of you write some of the most chilling villains, like the Reverend is one of the most chilling villains. And how do you build, and on the other scale, Jay, like Aiden is a character that we are terrified of, and yet you have managed to twist him in a way that the reader can identify with. Like, how do you go about structuring these characters?
I think you should always be able to like flip the script. You know what I mean? You should be able to tell the story from any point of view and understand that character. If you tell the story from the hero's point of view, you should be like, yeah, I understand why you would act that way, why you're feeling that way, why you're driven for that. But you should also be able to see it from the villain's point of view and go, yeah, you know what? If that kid was bugging me, I'd also want to kill him. You know, it's one of those things I think you have to really understand every character you have in the story.
Yeah. To that point, the Reverend in my story, I knew I had a sort of uniquely tricky job ahead of me because you want to make the reader understand the motivations of the villain, but also these villains are running a conversion therapy camp and traumatizing queer teens on purpose. So I didn't want it to be like so sympathetic, be like, yeah, I totally get why you're doing that. Like, yeah. So like there was a high wire act I needed to do. And because in general, just like I prefer my villains to be frightening, and I usually don't prefer them when they're like so graspable. Like I think like it's kind of, they come in like two different flavors, like where it's like you can and I knew I needed their motivations to be understood, like you knew why this specific person was doing that, but you still were kept at such a remove because they were so fearsome. And so that was a job.
Yeah, it's kind of multi-tiered. On the first level, you want the villain to almost feel like the hero in their own head. They should be able to rationalize everything they do, and from their own perspective and point of view, as warped as that may be, everything they do should be justifiable. But there is also something cool in a villain that is so alien and foreign in their mindset that you're not quite sure what they're going to do next. And everything is still kind of underpinned with a logic structure. Like Aiden is a pretty good example. It's basically pure mathematics. If the choice is between killing 1,000 people to save the lives of 1,001, it will do it, and will do it without hesitating because that's just math.
Yeah.
And from its point of view, that's perfectly logical. But if you're one of the 1,000 or related to one of the 1,000 that get killed to save the 1,001, it's a completely different point of view. So yeah, there's a coolness in that unpredictability as well. As long as everything is kind of underpinned by a logic, it's cool to push the limits of where that logic lies.
Yeah, I think for me, because I did a kind of a retelling, the villains were already established, but I felt like it was kind of my responsibility to kind of shift the lens a little bit. With fairy tales, it feels like you're focused on a very specific part of the story, and we don't really see what happens after the happily ever after, and we don't see what happened before. The villains are already kind of positioned and in play, and everybody's chosen a side. So I think for me, it was fun to kind of shift the lens and see how they ended up, where they ended up. And I think sometimes it's a question of who is really the villain, like why are the women in all of these stories the villains all the time, and what's the real story behind that, who's getting called a villain and who's not, and why. I also think it's kind of fun to have characters that are very morally gray. They're not good or bad. They're not, they haven't picked a side. They're kind of flip-flopping back and forth. And so, yeah, I think it's just about kind of exploring these characters. And, you know, I have villains that I'm like, yeah, I can understand why she did that. And it's a question of how far you go for somebody that you care about. And then I have villains who are just villains for villains' sake. And so, yeah, there's definitely different kinds of villains, but I like writing all of them. So yeah.
Mm-hmm.
It can be cool when the script gets switched also in like a book two or further down the story, when you actually learn what is driving this villain. If on a superficial level they look like just, you know, master of evil, but once you step inside their lives or inside their heads, you learn things about them that does make them a little more sympathetic. A good example is, did you guys watch Cobra Kai, which was the sequel to Karate Kid?
Yeah.
No one knows what the hell I'm talking about, but anyway, like Karate Kid was this 80s action movie where a kid got beaten up by bullies at high school and he learned karate and, you know, found self-empowerment and all was good. Cobra Kai is a sequel that kind of takes place 20 years later, and you see that same story from the point of view of the bullies, and you actually realize that from their point of view they were the good guys in that story, and you kind of see the way that story plays out over their lives. So you can have a lot of fun revealing those secrets and making your villain a more complex and maybe sympathetic character as a result.
Yeah, I think like also like on this, I think definitely if you're writing villains and if you're like studying evil and you're looking how to portray it, you know, and you're also kind of looking, you know, if you're paying attention to the news at all, then you're also, that's something where the last few years has definitely progressed. So Surrender Your Sons is a story that I wrote over 7 years, and definitely it metamorphized into something completely different in the last few years, into a better story, into a more true story, because of I was maybe going too complex with the villain motivations. And it was all very like, oh, they have reasons and they all have reasons. Each one of them has a reason. And then it kind of, you know, sometimes you do kind of, you know, as Kalynn said, like sometimes you do meet someone who is just, you're doing this just to hurt someone. Like, and that kind of, and I think a lot of times maybe like growing up through like, you know, Disney villain movies and whatnot, maybe you're kind of taught that there's always a motivation. And that's been kind of something that I know for myself has been a realization, is like, oh yeah, some people are just like motivated to either they've had suffering of their own too much or something, whatever reason they're doing it. Yeah, some people really, that can be more frightening. And I think I definitely tapped into that in this one, where it's like, oh yeah, I mean, they work there because they like working there.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, Adam, just because I've had the same kind of evolution of thought about villains over the last few years too, where I'm like, you know what, sometimes people are just evil, and that is where they are. Those were great
and
answers.
You can't that's super scary, because you can't reason with it. You can't see that point of view. It just has to be fought.
Yeah,
exactly. And on the subject of having to be fought, so flipping it to the heroes of your stories, how do you go about crafting a hero to lead such dark stories? Because, you know, in the panel description, we're talking about how do you write dark stories without making them bleak stories. Like, these are still rich, complex, hopeful stories. And how do you choose a main character to lead that? And I think all of you have really, really interesting choices that you've made for your main characters. Kalynn and Adam, I've found that both of your main characters are interesting in the way that they are go-getters. Like, they are not just satisfied with surviving things. They are interested in tearing down this system and helping others who are caught up in the same system and actually completely restructuring their world. So I'm really curious to hear about how you guys did that. And Jay and Z, you guys have chosen really, really cool, interesting ways of telling points of view through your main character's lenses. And I'm curious to hear about how you guys do that as well. So I'll start off with Kalynn and Adam, if you guys want to talk about how you go about creating these amazing characters.
Oh man. So Sophia, my main character, she's, a young woman, a queer Black girl who is living in this society that essentially renders her invisible. And so she knows who she is right from the beginning. She knows that she's not invisible, but it's her just confronting her family, her friends, the society around her, and she really demands that they meet her where she's at. She does not feel a need to compromise. She doesn't feel a need to conform. And I think for me, it was about really focusing on that human experience. She doesn't have, magical powers. She doesn't really have any, she just has this sense of self and this kind of very clear view of what's going on around her, and she's not satisfied to just be silent. And I think she also demands that the people around her also not be silent, because that for her is makes them complicit in what's going on. So I think for me, it was really just about focusing, kind of laser focus on that human experience, really making it clear that, she deserves her agency. She deserves, for her humanity to be respected. And the question she had to ask herself was how far am I willing to go? How much am I willing to sacrifice? And for her, it was everything, because living as she was under these oppressive systems was just not an option anymore. And with some of the other characters, we see the flip side of that. We see how there are people who are just not feeling safe enough or confident enough to really do the work that Sophia does, but that doesn't make them any less worthy of the outcome. And Sophia knows that. She recognizes that she needs to save herself, but in the process, maybe she can save the people around her. And I think that's her biggest motivation, and it's why she's willing to kind of go so far. So I think it's just about really making her relatable. She's just a young woman who's trying very hard to survive, and for her, survival is not enough. She wants to be able to be happy. She wants to thrive, and so I think it's just about making that very clear.
I mean, my main character, Connor, kind of follows a similar tack, but in different ways. Connor is, so Connor's situation is he's only been at this camp for a day, and everyone else there has been there for, 6 months, weeks, months, they've been there for much longer. And so all the rest of the teens there have adapted to these sort of systems of survival, when a lot of that is just keeping your head down and doing things quietly and slowly behind the scenes. But Connor's, to a fault, he's very, he's a country kid, he's mouthy, he's Gemini. So he's very to his own consistent downfall, he just spews kind of whatever he's thinking and saying. And it's very clear that what this camp was really missing for all this time was it was such a house of cards. It was just waiting for somebody to come in and just start poking and asking questions and asking the right questions and being this kind of badger. And that's definitely something where approaching writing Connor, I knew I wanted, to have that levity. I wanted him to be funny. I wanted him to process things kind of, how a lot of queer people process trauma, through humor, through making light of it. This was how he was going to get through it. He was going to get through it by keeping it light, keeping, kind of in his head, making fun of people, sometimes to their face, making fun of people, keeping a good cheer, as much as he possibly could, because that was his way of adapting and surviving. And like Kalynn said, with her character, it really was about making sure that, the reader also kind of, loved Connor and kind of loved that he was just going to agitate and be this kind of unstoppable force, but also that did not make what the other teens were doing there any less admirable. In a lot of cases in the book, it's more admirable to be doing what the other teens are doing, because this was what I wanted with Surrender Your Sons, was it to be a cross section really of the LGBTQ community and how we community build. Because I knew my main character was going to be a white cis gay boy who was privileged but had no idea, because he's living in a small farm town and he's the only gay he knows. So to him, he's the one who suffered the most. And he was going to be dropped on this island with a bunch of kids coming from different backgrounds, who had been traumatized longer, who had been through more, who had been through worse, who had been able to survive and help people in a different way. And a big part of Surrender Your Sons is him learning to listen to that and not be so like locomotive, like my way's the way, that it was like, okay, it's going to require a lot of shutting up and a lot of like listening to people who have been there the whole time, and working that way.
Z, I am really interested to hear about how you went about structuring Into the Real, because it has one of the most unique structures I've seen, and Quinn is just an amazing character. And you have many different versions of Quinn in this story. So please tell us more about Quinn and the creation of Quinn.
Into the Real is complex. It took me 3.5 years to write that book, because I was writing, it's divided, if you don't know about it, it's divided into 3 completely different worlds. And there is one person named Quinn, who in one world is genderqueer, in another presents as male, and another presents as female. And they're traveling through these worlds and come to a point where they realize, oh, I think I might just be one person. And each world, of course, is its own kind of horror. There's the camp, there's a world that's kind of like Silent Hill, there's a world that's very like post-apocalyptic war. And so it was difficult at first to tackle Quinn and how to fit Quinn into this world. And then I realized I have 13 published books, and something that each of my books has in common is that during writing those books, I am dealing with something, and you can look at all my books and see where I was in my life and what I was dealing with. And so when I realized I am Quinn, it was a lot easier to kind of get into their head and to see, you know what, I am Quinn, therefore I am each of these Quinns. I am this Quinn. You know, so it was complicated, but I really enjoyed seeing the different aspects. Something else I loved is that all of the characters, whether they're like, they might be a friend in one world, they're an enemy in another. And to kind of play with those emotions was interesting, because my own experience with people has been that people will surprise you, and not always in the best way. You know, you can come to somebody and tell them, hi, I'm genderqueer, and they might be really super close to you, but they might react in a way you weren't expecting. So that was kind of my way of playing with that. But yeah, all of my heroes are me. Not saying I'm heroic, but I'm always the center of my own stories.
I apologize if you hear my screaming toddler in the background. You play with some of the most interesting narrations in your stories. You know, in Nevernight, Mia's story is told by a mysterious, overarching narrator, and Illuminae is told in found footage. Aurora Chronicles are in shifting points of view. So how do you decide in terms of narration, like what brings you to those narrative decisions each time you create these stories? Like, are you using them to draw and feed deeper into the stories, you know, darker undertones? Is this a way of, I'm just really curious to hear about each of these decisions, because they're so specific and unique.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the way I see the main character is a lens through which to view the world in which they live. So you're building dark worlds with systems of oppression or injustices built into their bones, but you don't really get an understanding or appreciation of how they work until you see those systems intersect with the lives of the main characters. So Mia has her parents taken away. Katie and Ezra have their planet invaded and they're refugees on the run. Something horrible will happen to change the point of view of the main characters pretty much at the start of the narrative, and every decision they make after that point is informed by that initial intersection of world and character. So if you think about it from a craft point of view, you know, Hunger Games, you know, there's the districts and the games and the injustice built into the bones of that world, but it's not until you see that world through Katniss's lens that you really begin to understand it. And it's not until she is given a personal stake in the world by having her sister put at risk that she's kind of thrust into the story and collides with the world. So I guess the main character is a vehicle by which you can bring a human perspective to these big, wonderful, sometimes impersonal structures that you build in the bones of the world itself. So they put a human face.
So how do you know, in building these stories and these worlds, how do you know, like we had been talking a little bit about our characters fighting back in these systems and adapting to dark worlds. How do you know what to keep in and what to leave out? You know, some of your stories are set in contemporary, in our reality. The darkness is real. Others, if your story is in fantasy, it's still drawing on our realities. But how do you know to balance that? When do you know to pull back? When do you know to go ahead? And how have you ever felt like you've gone too far in the story and then had to pull back and you know, if you felt like there was too much darkness in your story?
When our editors tell us.
Yeah.
That's a good answer.
Yeah.
It can be hard to know because you know, when you're buried in the story, you tend to lose sight of everything. You know, you can't see the forest for the trees. So yeah, sometimes you do need an outsider's perspective, and that's what beta readers and editors are for. I had a moment when I was working on Empire earlier this year where I did the bad thing, the thing that I'm going to get the all caps tweets for, and I had to actually close my laptop and push it away, and I didn't come back to the computer for 2 days. But I still kept it in the end because it was intrinsic to the story. So yeah, sometimes you need to rely on the perspectives of other people who have distance. Mm-hmm. It's good to have a group of readers that you trust in that sense. But yeah, I tend to push dark as I am personally comfortable with. Everyone has their own limits and everyone has their own comfort points. I guess you as the storyteller have to decide what works for you. Ultimately, you're creating the book first and foremost for yourself. And if you're comfortable with the story that you're telling and the things that you're doing, then hopefully that story finds an audience. But yeah, everyone is different. So it is a really good question. It's sometimes hard to know where those limits lie.
Mm-hmm. I think for myself, since I was writing a story that was very fiercely contemporary and I was going to be dialoguing very directly with things that ruin a lot of people's lives, and then I was also kind of balancing that with fun adventure and jokey main character. That was the hardest part about writing this book 100%, was kind of really trusting when I had gone too far, what I had included, what kind of traumas was I showing on the page. And a lot of times I just really opted to show the after effects rather than like the moment itself. There's a few kind of key things to really in particular that I was really worried about, but I knew that I couldn't tell. I knew I wanted to tell the story of what conversion therapy does to people and how it tears apart families kind of forever and permanently. And I couldn't do that without talking about these two different things. And so I was like, okay, well, I'm going to do my best to first, make sure it was true and correct, then go over it again and say like, okay, is this, was I writing this to be scandalizing and to get the all caps tweet, like good energy for me, but like, was I potentially putting someone through something very, very hard? And so that was like Jay said, like beta readers trust them, editor trust them. And then lastly, for me, I just opened my book with an author's note, which is not really a list of content warnings, but I took basically a page and I kind of just introduced, basically, since I knew this was my debut, I basically just was saying, I'm going to introduce myself. I'm going to say, hi, before we all begin. We're going to talk about the following kind of things. Here's the reason why they're in there. I kind of talk about it like it's a fun adventure ride, kind of like a ride at Disneyland. They're like, hey, before we all strap in and have like a fun time, just this is a story about queer victory. You're gonna get all like such a good hope vibes from this. Just trust me on that. I'm very aware of what you're worried about going into a story like this. And here's some safety rules we got to go through real quick. And it was just like, we're gonna talk about the following things. It's not the whole book, it's a little bit. And I think doing that made me feel a whole lot better for writing what I did. And I think, and a lot of a lot of folks really have seen more than any other part of the book have really commented on the note as kind of being something that really like maybe at least helped them kind of feel like, okay, maybe if I'm not up for it right now, I'll kind of know at least what to expect.
Like Jay, I'm very comfortable with darkness. I'm more comfortable than a lot of people are. So I tend to just go and push the envelope, and I really rely on those outside voices to say, hey, maybe not that, you know? So I need that. Some people don't, but I do.
Yeah, I definitely struggled with how dark I could take this story because you know, it's a YA fantasy. I know that my target audience are, you know, young readers and young people, and you know, the thing I had to kind of keep in mind was that young people deal with these things too. And so, you know, there's domestic abuse. There is, you know, very violent homophobia. There is, you know, these systems that keep women under the thumb of their husbands, or in some case their sons. And so, you know, these were all things that were real. And I think that I had to approach it in a way that felt like I wasn't doing it to be gratuitous, or I wasn't doing it for shock value. I was doing it because, you know, I really needed to illustrate what was happening in this society. And kind of like Adam said, there are scenes where I show the aftermath. You know, there's domestic abuse, but you don't actually see that happen, but you see the immediate after effect of it, and it's devastating. And so it's just kind of finding a balance between, you know, the story that I need to tell and these elements that I feel like need to be included, and then making sure that I'm doing it in a way that is thoughtful of you know, the reader, people who will pick up this story and come across it. You know, I don't want them to feel like I've been kind of, I don't want it to feel gratuitous. I don't want it to feel like it was too much, or that it was done for, you know, any other reason than to further the story.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So I will open it up to reader questions now. We've got like a little accumulation here. So I thought this was a good question from Bethany. So when you guys go into the darker places in your story, how do you protect your own energy and your mental health as you go through and tell these stories?
I just reminded myself of like, okay, I know where this is going. Like there was another part where I was like, okay, well, I know he's really going through this, or she's really going through this. But even if it wasn't like happy ending, I knew it was like there is a moment that I'm like, okay, this is, you know, because I knew ultimately with conversion therapy, there are so many stories, there are so many wonderful books have been written, even in YA, about conversion therapy that are very real, and the realness. And I knew what I wanted to write was I wanted to write an adventure story of queer victory that was set in this world. And so I always wanted to remind myself to never get, you know, to dance too close to something where it became too overbearing. So I think for me, it was just reminding myself of the fun, exciting, like kick-ass scenes that they'd be able to get to later.
Well, for me, like I said, all my stories are self-exploration. So really, I tend to prepare like self-care things for after I'm writing. But while I'm writing, I really need to face those things head on within me, because otherwise for my goals in writing a story, I'm just missing the point. You know, I need to go to those dark places to really figure out whatever question it is that I'm asking about myself.
Mm.
Yeah, and like Adam said, even if you're in a dark spot in the book, there is usually going to be a spot of hope, either at the end of that arc or at the end of the story, that you can look forward to. So even if you're in, you know, like the character, you're in that dark moment before the dawn, that, you know, as cliched as it is, the sun rises, and so hopefully that's going to happen in your story. And if things are getting heavy in the telling of it, you can look forward to the moment where things get better.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Shout out to like my therapist. Like that's probably like, like an act of self-care. I think that sometimes, especially like, with some of the topics that I'm dealing with in Cinderella's Dead, like they're personal. Some of them stem from real experiences that I've had. And so it's good to have somebody to talk to who, knows what they're talking about and kind of helps. So yeah. And then just, I think self-care in general is a good idea. And I think sometimes you have to walk away from it if it's too much. Come back to it later, kind of decompress. So yeah.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So we're getting several questions that are circling the same thing, and that is for those who are writing for children or for young adult. How do you know how much darkness to put in? I guess what is the line between middle grade versus young adult versus adult? And I know that all of you, Z, I know you've written middle grade before, and Jay, you've written adult, so we have a whole range here. How do you decide what to fit into the story depending on the age range that you're writing for? And what exactly is the difference? Because it's not like younger stories are necessarily less dark. It's just told in kind of a different way.
Yeah, when it comes to YA, there's nothing off limits. You can go really pretty much as dark as you want to go. But when it comes to middle grade readers, they need obviously the same messages. A lot of them need to see that darkness, but they need to see it through a lens. Like with my Vlad Todd books, the entire series is about being bullied and feeling like you don't fit in, but it had to be told through a fantasy lens, of vampires and things like that, so that it wasn't hitting home so hard for them. So I found that that's really the key is with YA, just go, just write, but when it comes to middle grade, you have to have a bit more care to make sure that they're still getting what it is they're there for, but that it's not overwhelming to them.
Yeah, I would say to that, like I would say, like I think it's a difference between middle grade and YA is really, as he said, like it's really about like I view it as like how how immersed in the world is the reader supposed to be? Like how much are they supposed to really envision themselves in the driver's seat of this main character? And I think in YA, it's sort of advantageous. Like I think you want the reader to feel a lot more like they're living this story. They are as imperiled as this main character, as your characters are. Where in middle grade, I think probably it's more you're hearing, like maybe there's more of you're hearing a story about something happening to kind of someone else. There's a little maybe less personalization, but I feel like in YA definitely, like I feel like you want the reader to feel like this is happening to them. They are really experiencing this. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm kind of the same. As far as YA goes, there isn't a lot of limits. The idea that teenagers need to be coddled or protected or wrapped in cotton wool and spared the realities of the world is one that has always struck a false note with me. Teenagers are going to change the world. That's one of the reasons why I love writing for them. So yeah, I think we should confront these problems head on and explore them in an open and honest way. Obviously, if you're writing for a 13-year-old as opposed to a 19-year-old, there's a lot of difference, and you need to bear in mind who your actual target market is. But yeah, the idea that kids need to be protected from the harsh realities of the world is one that has never sat particularly well with me. I mean, I started reading Stephen King when I was 10 years old, and I turned out okay for a given value of okay. So.
Yeah, so I'm working on middle grade now, and it's I'm learning a lot as I go. I feel like with YA, I could push it a little bit further. And in middle grade, I'm still pushing it, but I'm just trying to, I guess, maybe find a different way to tell the story. I think it's just about craft. I think it's just about the way that you're telling the story. And then we can tell the same stories, but they can have these dark themes, these dark topics, and it's just about making it accessible to younger audiences. So it's been kind of an eye-opening experience for me to write middle grade, but but I still think there's room there to explore these different topics. And because I'm doing kind of a fantasy paranormal thing, it's against a backdrop of these very fantastical type events, and so it feels like more of a safe space to explore these other darker themes. It's just about finding the right balance.
For sure. Okay, we are all out of time, but thank you guys so much. Thank you to our amazing panelists for your wonderful answers. Thank you to our audience and your wonderful questions. We had a great time. I hope you all enjoy the rest of YALLWrite and have a wonderful day. Thank you guys. Take care.
Thanks, guys.